Hey guys, I know that there's a lot of DC20 content out there, but one thing that I haven't really seen, except from Dungeon Coach himself, is GM tips. So today, while I'm taking my short rest, I figured we could take a look through my GM bag of tricks and see some of my best bets for being a game master for DC20. There's a lot of things that carry over from being a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and also being a game master in Pathfinder 2nd edition. But there's a couple caveats to DC20. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is how initiative is handled in DC20. It's pretty similar to what you would expect, but there are some very important differences. The first thing is the way that critical successes and critical failures impact the initiative. So, if a player character gets a critical success, they will have advantage on any check during the first round, any one check that they want. So, I think this is a cool little reward for having a natural 20 on your initiative roll. There is another thing that Dungeon Coach mentioned in his video talking about the new initiative system in Beta 0.9, which is not out yet. But that initiative change is that instead of making a skill check, everybody just makes an attack check or a spell check so that everybody is rolling with the same bonuses. Dungeon Coach also said that he has a house rule that he was going to make sure was in the rules in 0.9. And it's another nice bonus to anybody who does end up rolling a natural 20 on their initiative. And what it does is if another person beats the initiative DC, they will also get to act in that first round of combat. And along with that, if you had multiple people with natural 20s on their initiative roll, you could end up with 3 or 4 players all going at the same time, depending on how many criticals you had. Interestingly, the critical failure on an initiative roll makes that player automatically go last in the initiative, and the first attack check made against them is going to be at advantage because that character will be exposed. And another very neat thing that Dungeon Coach mentioned in that 0.9 initiative video was that the same thing happens to you when you roll a natural 1 on an attack check or on a spell check in combat, is that it makes you exposed to the next attack against you, meaning that the next attack against you will be made at advantage. Honestly, I think this is a very cool way to add a little bit extra flair, a little bit of penalty to rolling that natural 1. And it's one that would work very cleanly in D&D. So I think this was a nice addition by the Dungeon Coach. That said, I do think there is an issue with the surprise condition. I think this surprise condition is a little bit too strong, and I would question the Dungeon Coach to consider the new Dungeons and Dragons 2024 version for surprise, which I think would work really well with DC20, especially with the fact that it uses advantage and disadvantage and also stacking advantage and disadvantage. But essentially, in the Dungeons and Dragons 2024 Player's Handbook, if a side is surprised, they have disadvantage on their initiative check. So, how would I handle this in DC20? What would be my proposal to coach? I would suggest if the players have surprised the enemies, give them advantage on their initiative. If they've really caught them off guard, maybe you even give them double advantage. It just works within the system's frame. And if the players were surprised, how would you handle it? The monsters don't roll initiative, so they don't need advantage on their initiatives. You give the players disadvantage instead. Maybe stacking disadvantage, like I had proposed with the players surprising the monsters. I think that the new D&D 2024 surprise rules might be worth looking at for DC20 as a possible future test play anyway. So, with that, I'm going to transition us over to a battle map where I can explain more about the initiative, how I handle it in my games, type in the code for rolling with advantage, disadvantage, so on and so forth. And you're not having to go to the die roller for the D20 rolls. It is possible to set up a 5th edition sheet to work with DC20, but it is a lot of work. So for the meantime, what I've been doing is just running DC20 kind of pen and paper, using the die roller for public rolls so that we can make our checks and then just manually add in the modifiers to determine if things hit or not. So far, it's been pretty good, but very reminiscent to sitting at a kitchen table playing with your friends. So when it comes time to roll initiative, one of the things that is different in DC20 is there's a lot of things that trigger when you roll initiative. For example, the monk in this party, he has an ability where he can enter a stance for free when initiative is rolled. So, my best bet to any aspiring game master for DC20 is right before you ask your players to roll for initiative, ask the players if they have any abilities that trigger on rolling for initiative. The next thing would be to ask all of your players to roll their attack check or their spell check for initiative. That is, of course, if you're already running on the 0.9 rules. I have decided to switch my tables over to 0.9 because I think it is cleaner and quicker. I think there is a case by case basis to run it with a skill check, but for the most part, I like the idea of standardizing it. What I do is I open up the turn order in roll 20. The first thing that I do is I right click on the player characters and then do add turn. This will add them to the initiative. And then once they roll, I ask them to just change their numbers here. I do the same thing for the enemies. I add them to the initiative. Essentially, in the long run, there should be a way to have these roll from a character sheet. But unfortunately, for now, this is the best way that I have found to do it in roll 20. Here would be, say, the monk. He gets a 21. The barbarian gets a 12. I know you guys can't see the rolls, but I figured I would just roll out a random initiative and see what happens. Spellblade gets a 17. And our druid gets a 16. So a pretty standard initiative DC, the GM would set that ahead of time, is 19, maybe 18, 17. It kind of depends on what's going on. In this scene, I figure the DC would be a 19. It's 4 enemies, 2 goblins, and they are, I would say, based on the way I have this scene set up, they have wolves on leashes, and one of the first things that they're going to do is sick the wolves on the player characters. So with the wolves and their extra perception, their extra awareness, I would set the DC at 19. And usually when I set my DCs for the initiative, it's based on how strong is the enemy, Do they have any extra advantages on in the situation? In this case, I'm giving like a bonus to the enemies to their initiative DC because of the wolves. I do set like a lower DC if the enemies are sitting around unaware. If the enemies are very slow, I might set a lower DC for that. But for this encounter, I have decided 19 would be the correct number. Now that we have all of the player characters' numbers in, I sort it by descending order, and we see that we have the monk, the spellblade, the druid, and the barbarian. The monk has beaten the initiative DC with a 21. There are no criticals, and there are no crit failures. No natural 20s and no natural 1s. Since the player character team has beaten the initiative DC, the monk would go first. And then the reason that the monsters are not activated into the turn order yet is that I, as the game master, am not sure which one I want to activate next. So, for example, let's say that our monk player spends one action point and moves up to the wolf. Our monk player spends another action point to make an attack against the wolf. He misses with a 6. He makes a second attack against the wolf using the dual wielding rules. He misses again with another 6. He has one action point left. He decides to take the help action against the wolf so that the next player that attacks the wolf will have a d8 on their attack. And what is the monk doing to impact the wolf? Let's say he's taunting the wolf. He's kind of trying to keep its focus so that it's distracted, and then that next attack will gain that d8 help die. Well, with that wolf being attacked, and this was another thing that Dungeon Coach said, was that the player characters actually kind of picked the initiative order for the enemies. I would activate that wolf next because thematically it kind of makes sense that the monk moved over and attacked the wolf, so we're going to have that wolf go next. Hopefully you saw what I did for roll 20. I just left clicked and held on the name of the person that I wanted to drag up, dragged that enemy up into the middle here, and then the wolf would take his turn. I would pass on the initiative. Wolf takes his turn. After the wolf takes his turn, the spellblade would take their turn. After the spellblade takes their turn, I would activate another enemy. Maybe the other wolf. Maybe that goblin releases his, for free, just drops the lead. And then this wolf over here goes. Okay. That wolf goes. The druid goes. Druid takes his turn. And then I activate one of the goblins. And then, as you see, the initiative is now completely spaced out. Enemy, good player, enemy, player, enemy, player. So that's how you would set up an initiative in DC20. That's how you would decide which enemies to activate. I hope that this section of the video was helpful for you, but I still have a couple more topics. Come with me over to another map and we'll talk about flanking rules, because this is one that is quite different in comparison to D&D. So I'm going to put the 5th edition flanking rules and the DC20 flanking rules up on the screen quick. Here is the DC20 flanking rules. You gain an additional +2 to your melee martial attack if your target is flanked. A creature is flanked when it has at least 2 or more enemies within one space of it that are not adjacent to each other, provided they aren't incapacitated or prone. At first glance, this sounds very similar to what you would expect, but there are a couple key differences. Looking at the D&D version, when a creature and at least one of its allies are adjacent to an enemy and on opposite sides or corners of the enemy space, they flank that enemy, and each of them has advantage on melee attack rolls against the enemy. So, looking at the map here, we're using the bugbear as the enemy. For 5th edition, this bugbear would be flanked by the commander and by the rogue. However, the fighter would have no benefit because the bugbear is not flanked by the fighter. So, the big difference in the DC20 version is that very first sentence. You gain an additional +2 to your melee martial attack if your target is flanked. So in DC20, here the bugbear is flanked. That means anybody making a melee martial attack against the bugbear would gain that +2 bonus to their attack roll because the bugbear is flanked. So that means that this fighter, if he has a reach weapon, he can, in fact, get that +2 bonus because the bugbear has what's essentially a flanked condition. It's not a real condition in the rules, but it's very much a condition as far as I can tell by reading this ability. The other interesting thing is you need to think about flanking differently in DC20. So in this case, the fighter and the commander do not have the bugbear flanked. Here, they do not have the bugbear flanked. The reason is that the commander and the fighter are adjacent to each other. But here, the bugbear is flanked, even though that's not normally what you would think of as flank. This is also a flanked bugbear because the commander and the fighter are both adjacent to the bugbear, but not adjacent to each other. Another thing that's noteworthy as far as the difference in flanking is in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you can flank with a reach weapon, meaning that would be a threaten. He would be threatening the bugbear. And if our commander was here, the bugbear would be flanked in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. However, because the flanking rules in DC20 specifically say that you gain the benefits of flanking if your target is flanked, and a creature is flanked when it has 2 or more enemies within one space of it, there's not 2 enemies within one space of the bugbear. So even though the fighter threatens the bugbear with a reach weapon, the bugbear would not be flanked by DC20's rules. But it is noteworthy that if the rogue was over here, well, now we have a flanked bugbear. Here the bugbear is flanked. Because the bugbear is flanked, the fighter will gain the +2 bonus for flanking on making that attack. So flanking in DC20 is really cool, really powerful, and it makes a lot of sense in general. The only thing that is a little strange is the threatening reach, but maybe it just makes it easier to tell if a creature is flanked if you just look to see if there's 2 or more enemies adjacent to the creature that aren't adjacent to each other. So one final scenario to show quick, and this should make perfect sense, is that even though the fighter in this example is not technically flanking the bugbear, it is flanked by the rogue and the commander, just like before. And the fighter would still, again, get the +2 bonus for flanking, even though they are in a line across here. Because the rogue and the commander cause the bugbear to be flanked, it doesn't matter that the rogue and the commander have an ally adjacent to them because they are not adjacent to each other. So this was something that actually took me and my play group about a half an hour to work out one day, as far as how the flanking rules are supposed to work. And it's really simple once you get past the fact that it doesn't work the way that it works in other games. And when you just go word for word, sentence for sentence, exactly what's written in the flanking in combat rules, it's actually makes a lot of sense. But you guys are in luck because flanking rules was not the final piece of my discussion for today. I saved the best for last, probably, and that is skill challenges. So, for skill challenges, we're going to do two things. First, I'm going to transition us back to the library, and I'm going to pop a couple things up on the screen which will help explain what a skill challenge is, what the pieces of a skill challenge are, and then I'm going to give you a real life example from one of my games. The first kind of skill challenge we're going to talk about are social skill challenges. All skill challenges have a challenge DC. In this case, it was 12, and a number of success points needed, usually equal to the number of player characters, but you could set the number of success points equal to the player characters minus one if it's an easier challenge. You could make it equal to the number of players plus one or plus two, depending on how difficult the challenge is. And then once you have a DC and a number of success points that are needed, the next thing is to decide what happens on a success and on each 5 that the player characters succeed by. In the case of this social skill challenge, the party gained 1 success point plus an additional success point for each 5 that they beat the DC by, plus an additional success point on a critical success. On a failure, they received no success points, and on a critical failure, they would lose 1 success point. So once you have the DCs and the number of success points needed to succeed, then once you have your success metrics, your failure metrics, and your critical failure metrics, then you need to come up with a resolution. So in this scenario, the resolution was when the challenge was over, the party would receive the following based on the number of success points that they'd earned. If they succeeded, so let's say you had a party of 4 players, they would need 4 success points. With the DC of 12, you would tally up how many success points they got, and if they succeed, they get a number of healing potions equal to the number of players. Each additional success in this scenario gave them an additional either invisibility potion, a silence trap, or an additional healing potion. And on a failure, they would get a number of healing potions equal to half the number of player characters. The interesting thing with skill challenges is you want to make them so that the players fail forward. If they do fail, you want them to fail in a way that still progresses the story forward. And that's why, even if they fail in this scenario, they receive a number of healing potions equal to half the number of player characters. Also, important to note that in DC20, you always round up. So if you had 3 players, they would still get at least 2 healing potions out of this social skill challenge. I will give a shout out to the dungeon coach, as this social skill challenge comes straight out of the Hunted one shot. But I couldn't think of any better way to first introduce everyone to what a skill challenge is and how you would build your own without first looking at one that was created by the creator of the game and it is the backbone of any skill challenge that you would make or choose to run. So this is our social skill challenge. Now, let's take a look at a combat skill challenge. So combat skill challenge, as we see here, it has many of the same characteristics as the social skill challenge. We still have a challenge DC. We still have a number of success points. These are unchanged in the hunted. It is still 12 for the DC, and the success points are equal to the number of player characters. Just like in the social skill challenge, you are setting rules for what happens on successes in each by 5, and what happens on a failure in each by 5, as well as a critical failure. You'll note that they've added the critical failure underneath the failure rather than having it be its own tab. And I think it's because it kind of builds on what was already there. So, on a success and each by 5, the party gains 1 success point, plus an additional success on a critical. For a failure and each by 5, the player character who failed takes 1 true damage and an additional 1 damage on a critical failure. So what this looks like is the DC is 12. So if a player character fails, they get, like, let's say a 10, they're going to take 1 point of damage. If they fail by 5 or more, so let's say they got a 7, they would end up with 2 damage. And then if they critically failed, see, I don't think that you could end up with 10 less. You would need a 2, and getting a 2, I don't think is really possible unless you picked a really bad skill, and I don't know any player that would do that. But if you did critically fail, and odds are if you critically failed, you would probably end up with a 5, you would take 1 true damage for failing, 1 true damage for failing by 5, and 1 true damage for critically failing. So 3 damage there. And then you have to look at the resolution, which in this case, when the challenge is over, the result is calculated based on the number of success points that they've earned. On a success, the players take no additional damage. On a failure, each player character who failed their check takes 1 additional true damage. So in the case where the player team failed, which would mean that they didn't earn, let's say there was 4 players, they didn't earn the 4 success points that were needed, and one of them critically failed, let's say, that player that critically failed, again, already took 3 damage, and then they're going to take another point of damage here. That's a significant amount of damage in DC20, which could have a player character very easily either bloodied, or you might be even well bloodied, depending on how high your might is. If you're a martial character, Marshall's gaining an extra bonus hit point at level 1, and then of course you gain 1 extra hit point for each point of might that you have. But if you were, say, a spellcaster and you only had +1 might, you would likely only have 7 hit points. And 4 hit points, you're going to be at 3 at the end of this combat challenge, should you critically fail and the party fail. Before I change the map, I'm going to give a real world example from the last time that I ran the hunted. So we did this combat skill challenge, and there was a monk player. He wanted to run underneath the monster and attempt to grapple it. So he was going to make a grapple check, and I think he just failed by 5. Yeah, he fell by 5. So he took 2 points of damage. I had another player who he wanted to use awareness to track the creature and kind of point out its movements to the other players. So he did really well with his check. And then there was 2 spellcasters, and they both wanted to cast spells at the target, at the creature. So the one player did really well with his spell check, and the other one failed their spell check. They just failed it, not like the monk character who failed by 5 or more. So the player who failed their spell check, I had to kind of figure out, okay, how did they take damage and what does this scene look like? So I knew that the monk was going to run underneath the creature and try to grab it. I knew that the two spellcasters were going to attempt to cast spells at it, and I knew that the other guy was kind of trying to track their movements. So once I had what everybody was going to do, I had them all roll, and then I had to kind of build out that scene. What does it look like? So I had the monk first in the scene run underneath this creature, and as he was running underneath it, I had the creature drop down on top of him, and like he kind of ducked and rolled, and he got scuffed up on the ground. That's how I flavored the 2 points of damage that he was taking during the challenge. I had the one guy tracking the creature and pointing out to the two spellcasters, okay, it's going over there, it's going over there. When it came time for the spellcasters, I had the creature jump at them, and while in the air, have the one player cast his spell, and he failed. And the creature was just about to land on top of this spellcaster, but then the other spellcaster's holy bolt flew out, hit the creature, and knocked it to the side. While the creature didn't land on top of our druid, he did end up getting kicked as the creature got thrown to the side and taking his 1 point of damage. So, the point of skill challenges and why they're so cool for me as a game master is you are cooperatively telling a story without the minutia of rolling for initiative and going round by round through something. So the first thing that you want to do when coming up with a skill challenge, of course, set a DC, set a number of success points, and then come up with the rules as far as what happens if they succeed or if they fail. Come up with a resolution of what happens. And then when it comes time to run the skill challenge, the first thing that I like to do is to go around the table and find out what everybody wants to do to contribute to the skill challenge. I don't have anybody roll yet because sometimes somebody might want to help, or I don't know the best order to story tell to build out the scene. So I wait to see what the players wanted to do. So I'll give you another real world example from that same game. In the social skill challenge, the one player, he wanted, this was the fighter, he wanted to intimidate the one guard. So he wanted to intimidate. The cleric wanted to cast guidance on the person doing the intimidating, so that would add a d8 help die. So the same as taking the help action, just reflavored as guidance. The druid wanted to use their druid domain and then cast crackling lightning from the druid domain, striking the three training dummies that were in a line. And the monk in the party wanted to uh, be launched in the air by the druid domain and flip kick all of the training dummies immediately after the lightning struck. So I gathered what everybody wanted to do, and then I had to piece it together in my mind what makes the most sense. I saw the intimidation happening first. So I had the cleric cast guidance, and I said, fighter, you feel a holy presence come over you. Go ahead and make your intimidation check. So, of course, then the cleric's rolling the d8 to add the help, and then the fighter makes his roll, and he did really well. Between them, they got enough successes to carry the party, because what ended up happening is the druid then, using their druid domain, they sent out like domain spaces, and then lightning arcing off of the last space, trying to strike the training dummies. So, okay, druid, make a spell check. And the druid actually failed their spell check. So I said the lightning fails to manifest. Monk, you get flung into the air. What do you do? Now make your attack check or an acrobatics check if you want to do it with some flair. So he made an acrobatics check. He ended up with a 2 on his roll, and it was a failure. So he was going to fall, but then to flavor the scene a little bit more, I was like, okay, give me one more acrobatics check. You did fail, but do you land on your feet? You're a monk. Let's give you at least the opportunity to kind of reclaim a little bit here. So he fails to impress the person that he was trying to impress, but lands on his feet. And the challenge was still carried by the guidance from the cleric and the intimidation check from the fighter. So it built out a really cool scene, and I hope that that kind of helped you to see that. But another real world one that I can give you with actual map is this one here. So a little bit of a peek behind my screen. You can see I have initiative DC19, and I have that in the Game Master layer and the GM layer so that only I can see that. The players won't know what that is. But essentially, wherever there's a combat, I put an initiative DC in the GM layer so that I have those notes. But when the players came upon these goblins, rather than attempting to fight them, they wanted to intimidate them. I guess I should have prefaced with spoilers. So I really haven't said anything too spoilery yet, but spoilers. Lost Mines of Phandelver. If you haven't played it, you want to play it, maybe switch off, come back after I'm done with this section. But spoiler warning done. The player characters had just killed the bugbear Clark, who is the leader of the cave. They had his crown, and the goblin boss, he said that if they wanted their friend Sildar alive, they should kill Clark, and then he would let Sildar go. Of course, he was going to extort them for more money anyway, but the players wanted to attempt to intimidate the goblins. I thought that because they had killed Clark, they had killed the boss, the biggest monster in here, they had proof of it, I would not only allow it, but I would lower the DC from what I had initially thought it would be. I set a DC of 14. Usually, Dungeon Coach says that it's like 5 less than the initiative DC, and 14 seemed pretty good. I would have gone with a much higher DC than 14 if it wasn't for the fact that they had proof of having killed the most dangerous thing in here. They were outnumbered 6-4, so the goblins still had quite a bit of resolve. But what ends up happening is Demetrius, our gnome, he makes the intimidation check, and the 3 other player characters chose to help. So I remember Dorval in the back here was like banging on his shield, and the others were shouting things. So they each rolled their D8 help die, and then Demetrius rolled their intimidation. And the total that they got was 31. If you guys watched the video about the help action, this is the scene that I was describing there. But essentially, DC 14. So by Demetrius succeeding, and well, the grand total being 31, you had the one success at 14, another success at 19, another success at 24, and the 4th success needed was 29, and they had 31, so they succeed. So what happened was I had the goblins intimidated. They decided to parlay with the party, and it was an interesting conclusion here. I won't bore you too much with those details. But I will say that I needed to have repercussions. What would have happened had they failed? So I'm going to transition us back to the library again, quick, so that we can look at a combat skill challenge, and then I'll explain what I would have done had they failed. So I already told you the challenge DC was 14. The success points that they needed was equal to the number of players. And each success, and by 5, was worth an additional point. If they had failed, each player who failed would have taken a point of damage. And if the party failed, not only would they have not intimidated the goblins, which would have led to an encounter, but each player who failed would have taken an additional point of damage. So I would have flavored that as any player who failed would have had spears chucked at them, and they would have taken a point of damage, 2 points of damage, whatever it was that it would have made sense. And then I would have rolled for initiative, and then the players would have been in a little bit of a hole because they would have been going into this encounter injured, but they would have still been able to resolve the scene. It would have actually turned to combat. So my suggestion to anybody who is looking to run DC20, especially if you're running some homebrew, is if the players come up with something creative that they want to do, try running it as a skill challenge, social if it's a social situation, combat if it's either a combat or if it has the potential to break out into combat. There was another scenario. It was actually in a 5th edition game, but I ran as a combat skill challenge because there were a couple enemies, but they weren't any real threat. They weren't going to beat the players. The question was, how much damage were they going to deal to the players? And it worked out very well. It sped things up. We didn't have to, roll for initiative and then run through like half an hour of combat. We were able to resolve it in, 10 minutes or so and continue the story. So I would definitely recommend try to use skill challenges. Just remember you need to do the 3 things. You need to set the DC and the number of success points needed. You need to come up with the rules as to what happens if somebody succeeds or fails and what happens on each 5, also on critical successes and critical failures, and then come up with the resolution, what happens based on if the players as a group succeed or fail. One final point on skill challenges and why I really like them in DC20 versus the way that skill checks are handled in other games is DC20 fosters an environment of creativity and teamwork that you don't see in other systems when you have a skill check. Instead of everybody making their own individual skill checks, this is bringing everybody together as a team, sometimes players helping other players, and it feels like everybody is truly working together to tell and build a scene rather than, okay, you pass, you fail, you like critically succeed, you critically fail. You tell a much better story, I think, with the skill challenges in DC20. So with that, I'm going to end my short rest. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or anything, you can add those in the comment section below. I will definitely answer all the comments. And until next time, I hope you keep rolling with us.